Good day. Today is Monday, 6th October 2025. I'm going to ask you to tick the like button if once you have seen this video, watched this video, or watched as much of the video as you want to see. Please tick the video and indicate that you've liked it, but of course the decision is up to you. Anyway, let's move on and let's discuss the situation in the world. And let's discuss firstly the extraordinary events that are playing out in France. They're not, in my opinion, extraordinary. They are unsurprising. We have in fact been leading up to this moment, at least since the elections, the parliamentary elections that took place last year. And one person, Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, is the person who ultimately is responsible for them. Now, what I am, of course, referring to is the unexpected by some, resignation of the French Prime Minister, Sébastien Lecornu, who has just resigned in the immediate aftermath of his failure to form a successful government. Now, Monsieur Lecornu, a very close political ally of President Macron, someone who has been working alongside Macron since the first moment that Macron became president of France, somebody who is often spoken of as Macron's most loyal political ally and close friend. Anyway, he has been Prime Minister of France, I understand, for all of 27 days. He's had the shortest time as Prime Minister of France of any French Prime Minister since Charles de Gaulle created the Fifth Republic back in the 1950s. So why are we here and what has happened? Well, the proximate cause to Sébastien Lecornu's resignation is that he was about to unveil a cabinet, a new lineup of the French government, and entirely unsurprisingly to anybody who is familiar with the situation in France, the new cabinet was essentially the same as the outgoing cabinet of the previous French Prime Minister, Monsieur Bayrou, the Prime Minister who lost power, well, was it 3-4 weeks ago, because he lost a vote of confidence in the French National Assembly when he tried to propose a budget. And the fact that the new Prime Minister was appointing essentially the identical cabinet as the old Prime Minister, unsurprisingly, provoked very much criticism from across the entire political spectrum in France. And Monsieur Lecornu seems rapidly discovered that he had no mandate or support within the French Parliament for his economic policy, his proposed economic and budget policy, which, to be clear, is the identical budget and economic policy as his predecessor, Monsieur Bayrou, whose budget and economic policy was the same as that of the previous unsuccessful Prime Minister, Michel Barnier. Anyway, because of that, Monsieur Lecornu took the decision that there was no point in waiting to be voted out of office. He might as well resign now and perhaps prepare for the French presidential elections, which are due to take place in just over a year's time, which is what I suspect he wants to do. I suspect he is not keen on going down as another defeated Prime Minister. His sights are on greater things. So France, once again, is without a Prime Minister and without a government. Now, this is an extraordinary situation, and it is the direct product of Emmanuel Macron's continuous intrigues and manipulations. Back last year, following the European Parliament elections, in which Marine Le Pen's National Rally did unusually well, without consulting widely, without informing the French Prime Minister of that time, or discussing matters with the cabinet, President Macron decided, without any real explanation or reason, to dissolve the French Parliament, the French National Assembly. Of course, the reason he did that was that he hoped that, faced by an actual parliamentary election, the French public would rally behind him and the centrist party that he has established, and which up to then was the dominant party in the French National Assembly, and therefore take the wind out of the sails of Marine Le Pen and the National Rally. It became immediately obvious that, like most of President Macron's clever schemes, this one had not been properly thought through. The French, by this time, were deeply tired, in fact sick of Emmanuel Macron and of his party, and it became very quickly obvious that a plurality of them were going to support the National Rally in the French parliamentary elections. Indeed, at one point, there was concerns on the part of some people, the French establishment, for example. But anyway, there were worries expressed that the National Rally might even win a majority in the French elections and in the French Parliament. So, as always happens, when it looks as if the National Rally is about to win, or at any rate as has happened up to now, and with the full support of Macron, and with the full support of the various other establishment parties and of the parties of the left, led by the left-wing firebrand Jean-Luc Mélenchon, agreements were reached whereby in constituencies where the National Rally might look as if it would win, either the candidate of the left or the candidate of the centre-right would stand down in the second round to enable whichever of those two candidates had won the most votes in the first round of the parliamentary election to stand against the National Rally and to win. And the result was that we got this anomalous situation that though the National Rally in the parliamentary elections won around a third of the votes, just over a third of the votes, the identical result to the one achieved by Keir Starmer's Labour Party in the British general election last year, which took place almost at the same time. Unlike Keir Starmer's Labour Party, which won a massive parliamentary majority on 1/3 of the vote, Marine Le Pen's National Rally on 1/3 of the vote as a result of these manipulations and arrangements that I've just discussed, ended up getting only the third largest number of seats in the French National Assembly. The somewhat unexpected winner in terms of numbers of seats in the French National Assembly was the left, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and Emmanuel Macron's party came second. Now, this has created a deeply fragmented and broken political scene in the French Parliament. Now, there was an obvious way out of the problem. Macron could have turned to the left, which, after all, had the largest number of seats in the French Parliament, even though they had been heavily outpolled in the actual vote by Marine Le Pen's National Rally. But he could have asked the left to propose the Prime Minister and worked out a coalition of centrist parties to support the Prime Minister proposed by the left. This would have been consistent with the political and parliamentary traditions of the Fifth Republic. It would have led to a period of what is called in France cohabitation. There would have been a president, Emmanuel Macron, who would have belonged to a party of the pro-European centre, and there would have been a prime minister who would have come from the left. But there have been several occasions over the period of the Fifth Republic where the two leading posts in the Republic, the presidency and the premiership, have been held by candidates of rival parties, and nonetheless it has still been possible to achieve a degree of consensus and to keep the government of France running. Well, other French presidents, François Mitterrand, Jacques Chirac, have done that, but Macron, Jupiter, as he has described himself, Napoleon, as others have called him, of course, he was not prepared to accept or submit to something like that. He has to be in control, though it was his decisions, his folly, that threw away the majority that he previously had in the French Parliament. He continued to insist that the new prime ministers, whatever prime ministers were appointed, should continue to be people ultimately loyal to himself. And he turned to the old right-wing party, the Les Républicains, the party that used to support Jacques Chirac and previously had emerged out of the political movement that was created in the 1960s by Charles de Gaulle, though in my opinion they have drifted very far from Charles de Gaulle's ideas and policies. Anyway, he turned to them. He tried to cobble a coalition around candidates drawn from that bloc, even though it is one of the smallest in the French National Assembly. Now, why he did that is, to some extent, it is politically very strange, because back in 2024, the candidate who was proposed by the left, Lucie Castex, as I discussed at the time, judging from her background, was a person in some ways fairly close to Macron in terms of political style and background, and scarcely someone one would have thought would be willing to make a revolutionary break with the politics of, if you like, post-Mitterrand France. Lucie Castex has been to all the right schools. She went to Sciences Po, one of the Grande École of France. She also then went to the next one, which is the École Nationale d'Administration, which, by the way, Macron also attended. The École Nationale d'Administration, ENA, is the traditional training ground of the French elite. She's worked at the World Bank. She's worked as budget director for the mayor of Paris, Hidalgo, who is, by the way, very much a part of what you might call the socialist mainstream. She has something in her past which is perhaps a little unusual, in that she studied for a time at a Chinese university in Shanghai, and I've heard that she speaks Chinese. But as I said, she is, in all respects, everything about her suggests, a person of basically the traditional French political class and establishment. I've always found it strange that Macron simply wouldn't work with her. Obviously, she's spoken against his pension reforms, which are deeply unpopular in France, and has spoken about reversing them. But I wonder whether, had she become Prime Minister, she would have actually done so. Given her background, I doubt it myself. But, of course, Jupiter could not have a Prime Minister chosen for him by his political opponents. He had to choose a Prime Minister himself, so he spurned Lucie Castex, and he's now picked 3 Prime Ministers, one after the other, Barnier, Bayrou, and Lecornu, and all 3, without support in the French National Assembly, have failed. Now, all of this sounds a little tedious. It is another parliamentary political intrigue. But of course, the situation in France is not good. The economy is stagnant. Some would say it is in decline. Living standards are under pressure. The French national debt continues to grow, and the burden of debt is increasing. The government appears to have lost control of its budget. It is running a large deficit, and it has shown no ability to bring it under control. I say the government has lost control over the budget, but the reality is that France, for at least the last year, has not had a proper government. I would add the debt has risen in France relentlessly throughout the time that Emmanuel Macron has been president of France, though he was elected on a promise of revolutionary change that would transform France and put it on a stable, long-term footing. He has completely failed to deliver anything like that. Macron instead has overwhelmingly focused on foreign policy, on grandiose plans for European integration. I have to say that my own sense of Macron is that he is profoundly detached from the interests and concerns of the French people and the sort of things that they care about: jobs, employment, prices, healthcare, immigration, all of those things. Dealing with those sort of bread and butter issues is something that bores him, and which at some level perhaps he even feels is beneath him. So it's debatable whether France has had a government for a long time anyway, putting aside all the problems that we've seen in France over the last year, because the president, the man who runs France, the man who is the country's leader, has been, to all intents and purposes, semi-detached, missing in action, if you prefer, from the first moment that he took office. Just to say. But regardless, what was probably already to a certain extent the case is no longer really disputable. It seems to me that over the last year, France, even as the situation there deteriorates, has simply lacked a government. Now, I know what I think Macron, as president of France, should now do. Firstly, he should call new parliamentary elections. After all, every attempt to try to square the circle, to try to find a prime minister, has failed. I think the possible opening last year of picking someone from the left like Lucie Castex has now passed. I think that if you were to turn now either to her or to someone like her, it would not be convincing, and it might create ructions in the markets. And I suspect that the mood in France, anyway, has moved beyond that kind of outcome. It might have worked a year ago. I doubt that it will work successfully now. So he needs to call parliamentary elections. Hopefully this time those parliamentary elections will not be scarred by the manipulations and intrigues that we saw in the last parliamentary elections and in every other election going back several years now, all of which have been focused on preventing the national rally from gaining a majority and winning. We have a simple, straightforward election. Most likely, very likely, the national rally will win and it will form a majority or be able to create a majority in the National Assembly, and it will form a government. Now, many people find this an absolutely horrifying prospect, and I make no expectations. I have no real expectations that the National Rally is in a position to improve the situation materially in France, or that it will necessarily make things better. But the point is that all of these maneuvers to exclude them from office, what they have actually managed to do is not prevent things from getting worse under the leadership of the National Rally. On the contrary, they have made things worse. France has been continuously deteriorating. What has been done has undermined the authority of the political system, the credibility of the political system. It has deepened cynicism in France, and it has created political chaos. If the National Rally is going to be defeated, then it should be defeated in a straightforward and open way through people putting forward effective arguments against it and proposing alternatives to the French people, as happens in a normally functioning democracy. So if we have elections, at least the National Rally will be able to form a government, and then we will see what it can do. As for Macron himself, well, it's been suggested that the thing that he should do is stand aside and remain president, effect leader of France in name only, and allow the new parliament to exercise control of France and to try to bring the situation in France back under control. Well, that would be better than what we have seen over the last year, where France's president has acted as a massive destabilizer within the French political system. But my own personal preference would be for Macron himself, who is, as I said, the proximate author of this crisis, to stand down and allow new presidential elections to take place. At that point, we would have a new president and a new parliament with a new majority, and perhaps, just possibly, they might be able to carry out real change. Change that France might benefit from. If they don't, well, at that point, politics, real politics, will have returned to France, and there is a possibility in that case that the pendulum will swing back and we could have a proper opposition and proper politics, and out of that, something also better for France and for Europe might also emerge. This situation of managed, manipulated politics, which we have seen throughout the time of Macron's hegemony, and which, by the way, brought him to power in the first place, has been utterly debilitating, and it needs to end. Will Macron do that? Well, I can't imagine him resigning. I thought for a time last year that he might do so, but of course he didn't. And as I said, we've seen this extraordinary procession of leaders, prime ministers, that he has picked instead. If you won't do that, then let him at least stand aside and allow the normal parliamentary electoral process to play out so that the French finally get a government which a plurality of them actually want. That parliament, that government, might have the authority finally to do something. Anyway, I say all of this. I am far from convinced that Macron has exhausted his ability for damage. I would not be surprised if over the next couple of days or weeks he comes up with some new clever scheme, all of which I suspect are focused on one purpose: to keep himself president and the set of policies that he supports, Project Ukraine, European integration, all of those things, going until the next presidential election comes in 2027, hoping perhaps in the meantime to groom Le Cornu as his successor. I'm afraid that that is more likely what we're going to see and what we're going to get. But anyway, we will see what decision Macron makes. I know there is a view that with Le Cornu's resignation, Macron has finally run out of road. Perhaps somebody should take him aside and tell him that. And if that person can also persuade Macron to go, well, as far as I'm concerned, that would be a gift for France. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about the situation in France today. We will see where events take us. We will see whether there is a final escape for France from this agony. But in the meantime, the ball continues to be, unfortunately, in Macron's hands, in Macron's court. Well, since I've started with politics, maybe in Europe, maybe I should touch briefly on politics in another European country. We've now got the complete results from the elections in the Czech Republic. It's clear that Mr. Babiš has won by a wider margin than had been expected, even though the opinion polls were suggesting that he would win. He has made various comments already. He's made it fairly clear, for example, that as far as he is concerned, Ukrainian membership of the EU is on hold, and that it can only really be advanced once the conflict, the war in Ukraine, is ended. He seems, for the moment, to be sticking to his position that President Pavel's various plans to go on arming Ukraine by purchases of artillery shells around the world. I've discussed that disastrous plan in many places. Anyway, it looks as if Prime Minister Babiš, as no doubt he will soon be, wants to put a stop to that, and perhaps also put a stop to the Czech Republic's own production of artillery shells and explosives for Ukraine. We'll see whether he sticks to that too. But bear in mind that just as we have had periods of political cohabitation in France in the past with a president and a prime minister who have opposing views, we are going to have the same happen in the Czech Republic, because though Prime Minister Babiš, well, is going to no doubt become the prime minister, he must enter into cohabitation with President Pavel, and President Pavel remains as committed to the various European orthodoxies and European projects as always. So, given that the presidency does retain certain residual powers in the Czech Republic, and given that the president also apparently has some say over coalition negotiations, I suspect that Babiš is going to be pushed towards compromise, and we will see where he is prepared to make those compromises. One thing I ought to say about Babiš is that he has actually been around in Czech politics for some time. He has been Prime Minister already. He absolutely does not seem to me an insurrectionary politician. He has spoken of his high regard for Viktor Orbán, the Prime Minister of Hungary, but he is in no sense politically dominant in the Czech Republic in the way that Viktor Orbán is. So I am far from convinced that Babiš really is going to break with the European consensus or has any real desire to. Perhaps what the election does show most clearly, however, is that there is now a clear plurality in the Czech Republic, as there is in more and more European states, which does want to break from the European consensus, though so far that plurality, which might eventually become a majority, has struggled to achieve an effect or even to find a single coherent voice. Anyway, that's the political situation in two European countries. Let me now turn to the perennial topic of these programs, which is the other great conflict which is taking place in Europe, the actual kinetic conflict which is taking place in Europe, and I mean, of course, the war in Ukraine. And again, over the last 24 hours, there has been a massive Russian drone and missile strike across Ukraine. I'm going to say that I think that this strike might also have been the biggest one. I made a program a few days ago, about a week ago, in which I spoke about how that particular strike that I talked about there was the biggest. My sense, and we will never have exact numbers, is that the latest Russian missile and drone strike, which targeted places right across Ukraine. There was no part of Ukraine which was unaffected, was the biggest. And we had attacks again on the energy complex, Ukraine's energy complex, and on its railway system, but industrial facilities, military warehouses, all of these sort of things were attacked as well. And this time, it seems that there was a major focus of attack on the city of Lvov in the farthest west of Ukraine. I believe I'm right in saying that it was the mayor of Lvov who said that up to 140 Geran drones targeted Lvov and something like 24 missiles. From what I can tell, these are mostly KH-101s, also targeted Lvov. I've seen a message that he posted, and interestingly enough, he seemed to make no claims for numbers of drones or missiles shot down by the Ukrainian air defenses. And, well, we saw this strike take place right across Ukraine, And as I've discussed in several programs now, as I discussed in my program yesterday, these strikes now recur every day and every night. We have never at any point since the start of the special military operation seen a campaign in the air by the Russians carried out like this, carried out with this level of intensity. And one person who is clearly becoming panicked and frightened by this is President Zelensky himself. Now, over the course of yesterday, he made a whole succession of comments. First of all, he expressed his utter dismay that even as the Russians have been conducting this further massive strike across Ukraine, there has been no response or even criticism against the Russians anywhere in the world, not even in the West. And about this, by the way, he's basically right. The United States, the administration, remains silent. The Europeans have hardly said anything. If we look at the politics in Europe, well, we've just seen the collapse of the French government, the further collapse of the French government. We have seen in the Czech Republic a party win which has expressed deep skepticism about continued support for Ukraine. And one gets the sense of political leaders right across Europe who once would have furiously criticized Russian drone and missile strikes of this kind, but at a loss now to know what to say, because they've gradually come to realize that whatever they say, these drone and missile strikes will continue, and that there is nothing that they can do to prevent them. There's been some flurry of excitement because 2 Norwegian F-35 fighter jets have arrived in Poland. There's been some murmurings in various parts of the internet, again, about the idea of establishing a no-fly zone, at least over western Ukraine. But about a week ago, or was it 2 weeks ago, the New York Times itself pointed out the enormous problems with doing something like this, that even assuming that the Russians took no counteraction, which of course they might do, they've spoken about how they would regard the presence of Western militaries in Ukraine, in any part of Ukraine, as a challenge that they would respond to kinetically. Anyway, putting that aside, the sheer number of drones and missiles that the Russians are now launching, and which they would be able to continue launching day after day, night after night, would rapidly drain NATO arsenals of expensive and difficult to produce and replace air-to-air missiles if the Western powers were to try to counter them. It is not like the situation with Iranian drone and missile strikes against Israel. These come in short bursts. You can deploy aircraft and missiles to shoot them down in the knowledge that no more will come. In a situation like the one we're seeing in Ukraine now, where those drones and missiles will simply keep on coming, trying to counter them would deplete your arsenals, your inventories of air-to-air missiles very, very quickly. And I suspect that this is absolutely not something that the US Air Force or European air forces want to do. So European leaders, with their own vulnerabilities exposed, are keeping silent about these Russian missile and drone attacks. So that was one thing that President Zelensky said, but then he went on to say something else, which was even more strange, because he said that what is needed in this situation is a unilateral ceasefire in the sky. And he went on to say that what was needed was concerted action to get Putin to stop. Now, this is again typical Zelensky language, because what does he exactly mean by a unilateral ceasefire? Now, if he wants to declare a unilateral ceasefire, if he wants to stop Ukrainian drones attacking positions in Russia or refineries in Russia, if he wants to stop Ukrainian missile strikes on Russia, and over the course of the last 24 hours, HIMARS missiles were used to attack a thermal power station in Belgorod, and they did hit this thermal power station, and for several hours power has been cut off to Belgorod, and 40,000 people in Belgorod and in the surrounding countryside have been out of power, just saying. Anyway, if he wants to declare a unilateral ceasefire, what prevents him? I mean, he could just announce it, presumably tomorrow. He could instruct Ukrainian drone operators, the Ukrainian military, to stop launching drone and missile strikes against Russia. But that is, of course, not what Zelensky wants to do. It is not what he means. When he talks about a unilateral ceasefire, what he means is that even as the Ukrainians continue to launch their drones and missiles against Russia, the Russians stop launching their far more numerous drones and far more powerful missiles against Ukraine. He makes this completely clear in his next sentence when he talks about the need for concerted action to be taken to force Putin to stop. So what he's really saying is that the Western powers, the United States, the Europeans, must between them do something to stop Putin from conducting this offensive in the sky against Ukraine. He doesn't appear to believe anymore that a no-fly zone in Western Ukraine is going to work. Presumably he has been told that this is impossible. He has perhaps lost realistic hope of Western missiles, air defense missiles, being supplied to Ukraine in the necessary quantities to counter or stop the Russian air offensive. And in fact, as the Financial Times pointed out a short time ago, and other articles have now appeared across the Western media and within Ukraine itself, Russian drones and especially missiles are now able to circumvent Ukrainian air defenses so that the Patriot missiles don't work anymore, assuming, of course, that they ever did. Anyway, he doesn't expect, therefore, that there's going to be a no-fly zone. He doesn't expect reinforcement with air defense missiles. He knows that Ukraine is being pounded every day by this Russian air offensive. So what he wants is the Western powers to start imposing pressure on the Russians to stop them, to get them to stop this air offensive. And presumably, though he doesn't spell it out, what that means is more sanctions, more bans on imports of Russian oil and gas into Europe, perhaps more sanctions preventing the import of Russian uranium, enriched uranium, by the United States, attempts to interfere with Russian energy trade, something of that kind. I noticed that during the Copenhagen summit meeting, Zelensky was constantly harping on, again, about sanctions and tariffs on Russia and on its various trading partners. And I suspect that to the extent that he has an idea or a plan, that is still what he is thinking about. But the fact that he didn't spell that out in this latest statement, again, perhaps exposes the extent of his private despair, because the United States has shown no interest in imposing those sweeping tariffs on buyers of Russian oil, China and India, first and foremost. And as perhaps Zelensky knows, far from wanting to move forward with tariffs against China and India, the European Union and separately Britain are currently in negotiations with India to conclude a trade agreement, to conclude trade agreements with India. With both of those trade agreements, the one between India and Britain, which by the way is a free trade agreement, and the trade agreement between the European Union and India, due to be agreed and completed by the end of this year. Obviously, those agreements are incompatible with the European Union imposing tariffs on India, tariffs which would in effect be sanctions against India for importing Russian gas and oil. So, Zelensky perhaps by now understands that there is not going to be action taken to stop the Russians from conducting their offensive in the sky. And perhaps the best way we should understand his statement, his comment about a unilateral ceasefire, is as a cry of despair, an indicator of his own desperation as he comes to understand and realize how bad the situation in the sky for Ukraine is now becoming. I'm going to add one further thing, by the way, and it's a pure aside. I'm not sure whether this plays any part in Zelensky's own calculations. But of course, the Russian attack on Ukraine's railway system might eventually have the potential to prevent movement or reduce movement in and out of Kiev. It might make movement in and out of Kiev especially dangerous if Ukrainian trains now face the possibility of attack by Russian drones. And bear in mind that Zelensky likes to leave Kiev on a fairly regular basis. And of course, when he does, he exits Kiev. If he wants to go abroad, he exits Kiev by train. He travels out of Ukraine, not by aircraft, but by rail. So it may be that part of the reason for his alarm is because the Russian offensive in the sky is finally having an effect on his own ability to keep moving. Just saying. I don't know, as I said, how important that is for him, but I just throw it out anyway. Anyway, that's Zelensky. On the Russian side, we have had further comments by President Putin of Russia, and they were made in a brief, impromptu conversation with Putin's favorite journalist, Pavel Zarubin. Now, Zarubin, as I pointed out on many occasions, is very close to Putin, very close to the Kremlin. He is somebody who is so well connected that you might almost describe him as part of the Kremlin team. Anyway, what was very interesting is that over the course of this very brief meeting with Zarubin, Putin repeated again the point that he made, which I discussed yesterday at the conference in Valdai, which is that if Tomahawk missiles are supplied by the United States to Ukraine and are used to conduct strikes against Russia, the Russians will respond. It will mean, at the very least, a complete freezing in relations between Russia and the United States. It will mean that all steps between Russia and the United States to improve relations, which have been taken since President Trump became president, that all of those steps will have been cancelled and thrown into reverse. And I noticed that this time, in his conversation with Zarubin, Putin appeared to leave open the possibility that the Russians might take additional action beyond that. Now, this is unusual. It is unusual for Putin to repeat himself in this way. After all, he's already set out his views in just 2 days ago in Valdai. So, well, actually, to be more precise, in Sochi, where the Valdai conference took place. So, why does he have to say the whole thing again, all over again, a second time? Well, there's some possible explanations. Perhaps the Russians feel that the Americans haven't yet got the message and that it needs to be underlined and re-emphasized and given in a standalone manner. Or perhaps there have been people within the Kremlin who felt that Putin didn't spell things out clearly enough over the course of his comments in Sochi. Personally, I tend to favour the second explanation. I've already spoken previously in previous programmes about the fact that I get the sense that on some matters, the hardening of views which is taking place in Russia is starting to affect Putin's own stance on these matters. So, for example, he is now being repeatedly challenged on the question of whether Ukraine can join the EU. And when last challenged about this at the meeting in Sochi, as I discussed in my program 2 days ago, unusually, surprisingly, Putin didn't answer. Perhaps people in Moscow are telling Putin, well, look, in the past, when missile attacks on our country were discussed, you talked about how this would be the crossing of a red line, an uncontrolled escalation, how we would reserve to ourselves the right to retaliate in kind. Why are you not repeating those warnings about the Tomahawks now? It may be that Putin doesn't want to be so explicit this time because he doesn't want to wreck the relationship with Trump, or perhaps more plausibly, he worries that if he did express himself in that forthright way, Trump would see that as a challenge and would feel obliged, given Trump's sensitivities about challenges, to respond, perhaps by doing the very thing that Putin was warning against, in other words, by supplying Tomahawks to Ukraine. And for that reason, Putin on this point has previously felt a need to pull his punches. Well, in the Zarubin interview, it seemed to me that Putin, without quite spelling it out, did finally leave the possibility of a more kinetic response. In other words, a response against American targets, in the event that there were Tomahawk missile strikes on Russia. Anyway, he appeared to leave that open. Now, I have to say that there is, again, and I've said it before, but I'm going to say it again, there is an extraordinary contrast between the calm and measured way in which Putin has responded and the Russians have responded to missile strikes on their country, facilitated at the very least by the Western powers, and the extraordinary hysteria in the West over unarmed reconnaissance drones crossing the border into Poland, and Russian fighter jets skirting an inhabited rock in the Baltic Sea, and possible drones or balloons, unidentified drones and balloons flying over airports in Northern Europe. I understand that it's balloons now, apparently affecting airports in Germany. I think some people in Europe are starting to understand that the rhetoric here has got completely out of control. And I noticed that the German defense minister, Boris Pistorius, is now finally calling for calm which should have been called for at the very start of these incidents 2 weeks ago. Anyway, that's the situation with the war in the sky. I'm increasingly coming round to the view that it is less and less likely that the Tomahawks will be sent to Ukraine. The launchers for them don't exist. They're unlikely to be available in significant numbers. And I think that by now, the Pentagon understands that if they were sent to Ukraine and launched against targets in Russia, exactly as Putin says, the Russian air defense system would quickly get on top of them and would start to shoot them down. Since I am talking, by the way, about the Russian air defense system, I understand that India was strongly impressed by the performance of the S-400 air defense missile system in the clash that India briefly had with Pakistan a few months ago. And there is word out that India wants to buy an additional 5 S-400 air defense systems from Russia. And it is quite likely, I'm guessing, that an agreement, maybe a memorandum of understanding or an agreement in principle to do this, will be signed over the course of Putin's trip to India, which is now only a few weeks away. And I'm going to make the further guess that the Indians, over the course of that same trip, are also going to sign agreements with the Russians, both for the eventual purchase of Sukhoi 57 fifth generation fighters, but also for the production of these fighter jets, perhaps in a new two-man form in India itself. One of the attractions for the Indians of defense cooperation with the Russians is that going all the way back to the 1960s, the Russians have repeatedly shown a far greater willingness to share technology, advanced technology, with the Indians than any other supplier of defense equipment to India has been. And given India's need for fifth generation fighters, I would have thought that the attractions of entering into a co-production agreement with the Russians, I say a co-production agreement, an Indian production equipment agreement for production of Sukhoi 57 fighter jets in India, new jets geared to Indian needs. It seems to me that that will be very attractive. By the way, Wolfgang Munchau has recently been in India and has had discussions with various people in India. He speaks about how India remains absolutely committed to BRICS, how the tariffs that the United States has recently imposed on India, far from deterring India from engaging with Russia, has caused India to commit further to the BRICS, and how the Indians are moving forward with industrial and technological developments and are seeking to deepen their relations with Russia and to continue the arduous task, the doubtless arduous task, of improving their relations with China as well. Anyway, there we go. Now, let's finish by discussing the situation on the Ukrainian front lines, because obviously it is there that the war is going to be decided. We are in a situation where there is no movement towards negotiations of any kind. Zelensky may be demanding a unilateral ceasefire in the sky, but he refuses to send negotiators to meet with the Russians again in Istanbul. He continues to turn a deaf ear to Russian proposals for the setting up of 3 working parties to move forward with discussions on a potential settlement of the conflict. The diplomacy intended to end the conflict in Ukraine remains frozen, and frankly, I expect that it will continue to do so. So, what is going on the front lines? Well, the place which I always focus on in these discussions is Pokrovsk. And over the last couple of hours, there's been more reports of further Russian advances in Pokrovsk, or perhaps that's less accurate. It would be more correct to say that we've had further information that confirms the Russian reports that we have already had, that the Russians have gained control of important positions in southeastern Pokrovsk and now control the whole of Pokrovsk, including central Pokrovsk and western Pokrovsk, south of the railway line that bisects Покровsk. The Ukrainians still hold positions north of the railway line, except at the western end of Покровsk, where the Russians have crossed the railway line and are besieging the Ukrainians in the area or in the industrial area to the northwest of Покровsk. So it does look as if we have seen the pivot moment in the Battle of Покровsk. Now that the Russians control so much of Покровsk, with the Ukrainian defenders mostly cut off from resupply, it seems to me that the story from this point onward is of managing the battle for the Russians, working towards the now inevitable outcome, which will be the capture of Покровsk. I'm not going to try and provide a timeline, but it seems to me that this is now essentially a done thing, and I don't think anybody any longer disputes that this is the case. In the area of the Russian breakthrough, northeast of Покровsk, the so-called Dobropilya direction, the word is of Russian advances also, and of the Russians now advancing into the village of Vladimirovka on the western side of this area of breakthrough, moving towards the recapture of this village, which was the one place over the course of the various Ukrainian counterattacks that have taken place since August, where the Ukrainians made some progress. About 3 days ago, there were reports that the Russians further east have managed to advance close to the village of Sofivka, and that they've cut a supply line, the main supply line that supplies Ukrainian troops in Vladimirovka and in these other villages in this area to the east of the breakthrough. It could be that it is a shortage of supplies that is causing the Ukrainians to fall back in this area, or it could be that Ukrainian forces are now so depleted that this has obliged them to fall back, that all of those counterattacks have caused so many losses for the Ukrainian troops that they have no ability to resist the Russian counterattacks anymore. I don't know. I don't think in overall terms it actually matters very much. If the Russians, when the Russians recapture Vladimirovka and perhaps the more important village in this area, which is Shakhovo, then the entire area of the breakthrough, the Russian breakthrough, will have been fully consolidated, and the Ukrainians will be in a deep operational crisis, one which will not only affect the situation in Покровsk, but one which will open the way for an eventual encirclement of Konstantinovka, the next town that the Russians are going to target, which is located to the east. So anyway, that's that battle. There's battles going on elsewhere. The Russians continue their advance in Zaporozhye. The Ukrainians appear to be becoming increasingly alarmed about the Russian advance in this area, about the Russian push into Uspenovka and Poltavka, these fortified villages on the way to the main road supplying the Ukrainian garrison in Gulyapolye. There are other reports of further Russian advances to the north in this area as well, closer towards the road. And, if we have a situation where supplies to Gulyapolye are cut off and this town comes under siege and is, of course, eventually captured, then I think this is going to be a very major psychological blow for Ukraine, perhaps an even bigger blow in some respects than the loss of Donbass itself would be, because it would mean that the Russians would be coming within range of the Dnieper, of the cities of Zaporozhye and Dnipro, and they would start to look unstoppable, and that would bring the Russian army to the very center of Ukraine at its economically most important point. Anyway, we're not there yet, and there's still an awful lot to go, to happen before we do. Further north, the Russians have captured more places close to Siversk, and of course they now claim that fighting in Siversk is itself underway, and they claim to have made more advances in Liman. And well, there's been less news from Kupiansk, but I suspect that what will happen in Kupiansk is that we will suddenly learn that Ukrainian resistance in that town has collapsed as well, and that the whole town is under Russian control. And I still believe that Kupiansk is going to be the first of these towns currently under siege by the Russians, which will fall. And when one of them falls, the others will do so quickly, one after the other, and then we will start to see, as I said, the entire Ukrainian defense line fold like a row of dominoes. And perhaps the most dramatic footage from the war that I have seen over the last 24 hours is footage provided by a Russian fiber optic drone. You know it's a fiber optic drone because the picture, the film, is, as is always the case with these drones, exceptionally clear. And this fiber optic drone was flying over the main central avenue of the city of Kramatorsk, the biggest city still under Ukrainian control in Donbass, the one that forms the biggest town, the biggest city, the biggest place in the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk-Konstantinovka conurbation. And at one level, what this drone footage showed is that there is still a kind of air of normality in Kramatorsk. There are large numbers of civilians still living there. The buildings along this avenue appeared completely undamaged, and there still seem to be the usual signs of civilian life. But this drone, this fiber optic drone, was on a hunt, and it was hunting a particular vehicle, a parked car in Kramatorsk itself. What information the Russians had about this particular parked car, or whether it was attacked at random, I have no idea. But anyway, an attack took place on this car, and it was clearly destroyed. So the Russians are now signaling that they can operate drones, fiber optic drones, over central Kramatorsk. And that is going to ring further alarm bells in Kiev. It is a sign that the final battle in Donbass is now just over the horizon. It might be no more than a few weeks, or perhaps at most months away. It could begin in earnest before the end of this year. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's program. Let me remind you again that if you've liked this program, you should tick the like button. And by the way, also check your subscription to this channel. But also please remember that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. I should say that we are also now in the process of establishing a Substack page. We're already uploading our videos onto that page. I intend to be writing short pieces for that page also, so you can find it all there. It's still in process of development, but we've almost got it ready to go. And in the meantime, let me remind you that you can also go to our shop, check out the many things that you will find there. And well, as I said, this is where I finish my program today. So more from me tomorrow. Until then, have a very good day and speak to you soon.